The warning, no matter what happens, he whispered, placing the small silver key in her hand. Never open that door. Sophie stared at him, confused. The key was cold in her palm, heavier than it looked. Daniel's tone wasn't playful. His eyes were sharp, serious. He wasn't joking. He meant every word. It had only been an hour since she arrived at the old stone house, a beautiful but mysterious estate tucked away at the foot of the Swiss Alps. Sophie had flown across the world for this, a 3-month writer's retreat to finish her novel. Silence, space, and no distractions. That's what the brochure promised. Daniel, the owner, had greeted her at the train station with a polite smile and quiet charm. He wasn't talkative, but he was kind. His house looked like something out of a storybook. Thick stone walls, arched windows, and wooden beams that creaked under the weight of time. The perfect escape. But now, standing in the hallway with this strange man handing her a key, everything felt wrong. Sophie blinked. Wait, what's behind the door? He didn't answer, just gave her a tired look. His fingers curled around hers, slowly closing her hand over the key. Promise me, he said again. You won't open it. Not for any reason. Daniel, she said, trying to smile. This feels like a horror movie. His face didn't change. This isn't a movie, Sophie. She felt a chill. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about that door. The house was mostly quiet, except for the occasional creak and whistle of the wind outside. Snow had started falling again, gently tapping the windows. The fireplace in her room glowed softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She had placed the key in the drawer beside her bed, but she kept glancing at it like it might move on its own. Why such a dramatic warning? What could possibly be behind a door in an old house that required such secrecy? She tried to sleep, but her thoughts wandered. What if it was nothing? What if it was everything? The next morning, sunshine poured in through the tall windows, and the house looked much less threatening. Daniel was gone. A note on the kitchen counter said he had to visit the nearest town to pick up supplies. Back before dark. Make yourself at home. With nothing else to do, Sophie explored the estate. The house was larger than she expected, full of old books, quiet hallways, and strange artwork that made her pause. She found a hidden staircase, a dusty piano, even a tiny balcony that looked out over the snow-covered forest. But her feet eventually led her back to the west corridor, and there it was, the door. It looked even more ordinary in daylight. Thick wood, a faded brass knob, no label or sign, just cliffs. Sophie stared at it for a long time. She didn't touch it, but her hand itched too. Later, as she sat with a cup of tea near the window, she caught herself staring down at the key again. This wasn't like her. She wasn't nosy. She respected boundaries. But something about this house, this key, it played with her thoughts. That night, something strange happened. She was half asleep when she heard it. Click. It was soft but clear. The sound of metal against wood. She sat up fast, heart pounding. Everything in her room looked normal. Until she saw it. The key. It was on the floor, near her bedroom door. She had placed it in the drawer. She was sure of it. Sophie got up slowly, picked it up with shaky fingers, and looked out into the hallway. Empty. But her gut twisted with unease. Was she imagining things? She kept the key under her pillow that night, and left a light on. Over the next few days, Daniel returned, acting normal. He offered her local pastries, showed her old journals from writers who had stayed before, even complimented the notes she'd made for her book. But he never mentioned the key again, and he never, not once, went near the West Wing. Sophie tried to ask again. That door, what's behind it? Daniel looked at her for a long time before answering. Pain. That's not a real answer. It's the only one I have. The conversation ended there. One evening, Sophie stood in front of the door again. This time, she pulled the key from her coat pocket and held it near the lock. It was silent, still empty, but she could feel something. Like the air around the door was heavier, thicker. Her hand trembled. She was about to slide the key in when a cold draft blew through the hallway and made her jump. She turned away quickly and ran back to her room. Then came the knock. That night, around midnight. Knock, 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 knock. Slow, gentle from the other side of the door. Sophie sat up straight in bed, frozen. She waited. Knock, knock. Then a voice, low, barely a whisper. Please, help. She couldn't breathe. There was someone behind the door. Sophie didn't move. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the door to her room, heart pounding so hard she could hear it. The whisper still echoed in her ears. Please, help. She told herself she had imagined it. It was late. The wind outside was loud. Old houses made strange sounds. Right. Maybe it had been her dream. Maybe she was sleepwalking. Maybe knock knock. Again. Same door. Same soft knocking. Sophie grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. She stood, feet cold against the wooden floor, and slowly walked into the hallway. It was silent now. Too silent. The west corridor stretched ahead, darker than usual. The air felt heavier again, like it was holding its breath. She took a step toward the forbidden door, then another dot. When she reached it, she stood still, pressing her ear against the wood. Nothing, no voice, no sound, just her own breathing and the loud beating of her heart. She didn't open it. She couldn't. She ran back to her room and locked the door. In the morning, everything looked normal again. The sun was shining. Birds chirped outside. The old house felt calm, peaceful. Sophie stood at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee with shaky hands, waiting for Daniel to return. But he didn't come back that day. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. Snow began to fall again, gently covering the pine trees outside. No calls, no messages. Sophie checked the landline. No dial tone. Her phone had one bar of signal, barely enough to load anything. She tried calling Daniel. No answer. She even thought about calling the police, but what would she say? Someone whispered through a door. I was told not to open. She sounded crazy just thinking it. That night, she kept the lights on in the hallway. She sat in the living room for hours, reading an old mystery novel she found in the study, but her eyes kept drifting to the hallway. To the door. It called to her. At midnight, the knocking returned. Knock, knock. This time she was ready. She had her phone, her flashlight, and the key in her hand. She stepped into the hallway, moving slowly. Her heart was racing, but her mind was focused. She reached the door, pressed her ear against it. Hello, she whispered. Silence. Then, please, help me. I don't want to be here anymore. It was a woman's voice, soft, weak. Sophie's fingers trembled. Who are you? She asked. No reply. She backed away, scared, confused, and unsure what to believe. She couldn't sleep again. The next morning, Daniel finally returned. Sophie was waiting in the hallway when he walked in. His face was pale, his eyes red. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Where were you? She asked, voice sharp. He avoided her eyes. Something came up. Family problem. There's someone behind that door. Daniel. He froze. She continued. She whispered to me. She said, help me. Last night, and the night before that. What's going on? Daniel looked tired, not just in his face, but in his soul. I told you not to go near it. You didn't say someone was trapped inside. She's not trapped, he said softly. She's left behind. Sophie didn't understand. What does that mean? Who is she? Daniel walked past her, into the living room, and sat down. He stared at the fireplace without speaking. Finally, he said her name was Elise. She was my wife. Sophie blinked. He nodded. She died 2 years ago. In that room. The room spun around Sophie. Then who am I hearing? Daniel looked up. That's why I warned you. Some things don't leave, even after they die. Sophie didn't know what to say. She'd never believed in ghosts, spirits, haunted places. But now, her hands were cold, and her heart was full of questions. She died in that room. She repeated. Daniel nodded. She took her own life. I don't know why. She locked herself in. I was too late. After that, strange things started happening. I locked the room. I couldn't bear to look inside again. Sophie sat across from him, the key still in her pocket. You should have told me. I tried, he said quietly. But some stories are too painful to say out loud. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering Daniel's broken voice. She was my wife. She imagined Elise, a woman locked in that room, in pain, alone. Why had she done it? What had driven her to such a place? Knock, knock. Again. This time, Sophie didn't hesitate. She walked toward the door, barefoot, heart pounding. Elise, she whispered. No reply. She pulled the key from her pocket. Hands shaking. She slid it into the lock. Click. The door creaked open slightly, but she didn't push it all the way. The air was freezing cold. Dark. Something moved inside. She opened the door just a little wider and shone her flashlight in. What she saw made her gasp. A woman standing in the corner, hair long and tangled, skin pale, eyes hollow. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Sophie, and Sophie couldn't move. She felt like she was sinking into the floor, heart frozen, lungs refusing to breathe. The flashlight flickered, then turned off. Click. The door slammed shut behind her. The door slammed behind her. Sophie screamed and spun around, fumbling in the darkness. She grabbed at the doorknob and twisted, but it wouldn't move. Locked. Her flashlight was still dead. The cold in the room wrapped around her like icy hands, and the darkness felt alive, heavy, thick, watching her. She whispered, her voice cracking. No reply, but she felt it. She wasn't alone. Slowly, her eyes adjusted. The faint moonlight through the cracked window showed a simple room, an old bed, a dusty mirror, a broken chair. Nothing unusual, except the woman in the corner was gone. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She backed up, her hands shaking, searching for the outline of the door. Suddenly, a whisper brushed past her ear. "Why did you open the door?" She turned, but there was no one there. "Who are you?" Sophie cried out. "What do you want from me?" The air shifted. Then came the voice again, soft, sad. "You shouldn't have come here." He lied. Sophie froze. Who lied? No answer, just silence. Back in the hallway, Daniel stood with a lantern in his hand. He had heard the slam. He dropped the lantern and ran toward the west corridor. No, he whispered, panic rising in his chest. He reached the door. It wouldn't open. He pulled, pushed, kicked it. "Sophie," he shouted, "can you hear me?" No reply. His hands trembled as he pulled a ring of old keys from his coat pocket. He tried one, then another. None of them worked. His breathing grew heavy. "Please, not again." He sank to his knees, leaning against the door. "I told you not to open it." Inside, Sophie was sitting on the floor now, hugging her knees. The cold was getting worse. Her lips trembled. She tried her phone again. "Still dead," she whispered to herself. "This can't be real. This can't be happening." Then she noticed something strange. The room wasn't dusty anymore. The mirror was clean. The chair looked new. The bed had sheets on it, like someone had just made it. What? She blinked. Everything around her had changed. It was the same room, but it looked like it did years ago. She stood slowly and stepped toward the mirror. Her reflection looked normal, but in the reflection, the door behind her was wide open. She spun around. It was still shut. She looked back in the mirror. Now, a woman stood behind her. Sophie turned again, and this time she was there. The pale woman with the long tangled hair, dressed in a white gown, face full of sadness, but her eyes were Sophie's eyes. The woman stepped closer. "You need to listen," she whispered. "Who are you?" Sophie asked again, her voice dry. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she said, "He never told you what happened, did he, Daniel?" Sophie whispered. The woman nodded slowly. "He didn't tell you who locked me in." Outside the door, Daniel was crying now. He kept whispering Sophie's name. "I'm sorry," he said over and over. "I didn't know it would happen again." Inside the room, the spirit of Elise moved closer. "He said I locked myself in," she whispered. "But that's not true." Sophie's hands were ice cold. Her mind raced. "What are you saying?" Elise looked into her eyes. "He locked the door." From the outside, Sophie shook her head. No, Daniel wouldn't. "He didn't want me to leave," Elise said. "He said I was sick, that I needed to stay quiet. But I wasn't sick. I was scared of him." Sophie backed away. Everything felt upside down. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you remind me of me," Elise whispered. "And if you stay, he'll trap you too." Sophie's heart skipped. Then the spirit stepped aside and pointed to the wall. There, carved into the wood, were words Sophie hadn't seen before. "He lies." Suddenly, the cold vanished. The door creaked open. Daniel stood on the other side, breathless, eyes wide. He looked at Sophie like he'd seen a ghost. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice shaking. Sophie stepped out slowly. "What happened in that room?" Daniel hesitated. "You saw her, didn't you, Elise?" He didn't answer. Sophie looked at him differently now. She said, "You locked her in." Daniel's face turned pale. "She wasn't well. She said she wasn't sick. She said she was scared." Daniel looked away. "You don't understand." "Then explain it." He said nothing, just turned and walked down the hallway. Later that night, Sophie sat in her room, staring at the key. Everything inside her felt twisted, confused, angry. Was Daniel dangerous? Was Elise telling the truth? Was this house safe? She heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside her door. She held her breath. Then came a soft whisper. "You opened the door. Now you have to finish it." The whisper outside Sophie's door faded into silence. She sat frozen, the key still in her hand, her mind spinning with everything she had seen and heard. Elise's voice echoed in her thoughts. "He lies. He locked me in. You remind me of me." She had come to this place to write a novel. Now, she was living in something darker than any story she could have imagined. Sophie stood slowly and walked to the mirror. Her reflection looked tired, pale skin, dark circles under her eyes. She no longer recognized the woman looking back at her. For the first time in her life, she didn't know who to trust. The next morning, Daniel acted like nothing had happened. He made tea. He asked about her writing. He even offered to drive her into town for groceries. But Sophie watched him closely. He smiled the same way, spoke the same way. But something had changed. There was a strange calm in him now. To calm. Did Elise ever get help? Sophie asked. Suddenly, as they sat near the fireplace, Daniel didn't look at her. She didn't want it, or she wasn't allowed to ask. He flinched. "Just for a second. You don't understand," he said. Elise wasn't stable. She heard voices. She would scream at night, lock herself in 4 hours. I tried to help her, but she wouldn't let me. Sophie stared at him. "So you locked her in that room?" Daniel looked at her sharply. "I never said that you didn't have to." He stood. "Let's not do this now." "Why did she carve the words into the wall?" Sophie continued, voice rising. "Why does the room look like it's stuck in time? Why is her spirit still trapped there, Daniel?" Daniel's expression changed. The warmth in his face melted away. "She chose to stay," he said coldly. "I didn't force her." That night, Sophie couldn't sleep again. She kept thinking of the look in Daniel's eyes, the shift from charm to coldness. What if Elise was right? What if she really was locked in, not just behind a door, but behind silence, pain, and fear? And if Daniel had done it to her, would he do it again? A part of Sophie wanted to leave right away, pack her things and run. But another part whispered, "Finish it." Elise hadn't appeared again. But her message was clear. The truth was buried. In that room, in the walls, in the house. And it was up to Sophie to find it. The next day, while Daniel went into town, Sophie explored again. This time, she entered the west corridor with purpose. She opened the door to Elise's room once more. It was quiet now, cold, but not terrifying. She searched every inch of it. Nothing under the bed, nothing in the drawers. Then she noticed a loose board beneath the window. She pulled at it. It came free with a soft crack. Behind it was a small wooden box. Sophie's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Elise's sister. Each letter told a story of Elise's growing fear, of Daniel's control, of how he wouldn't let her leave, of how he threatened her. The last letter was never sent. It ended with one line: "If I disappear, tell them he did this." Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't just dealing with a ghost. She was standing in the middle of a buried crime. Later that evening, Daniel returned. Earlier than expected. Sophie quickly hid the box under her bed. He walked in with bags of groceries and his usual calm smile. "You didn't go snooping, did you?" His words were light, almost playful, but there was something behind his voice, a warning. Sophie forced a smile. "Of course not." They ate dinner together in silence. Sophie noticed the way he kept watching her, how his eyes lingered a little too long, how his hands stayed close to his pocket, where he always kept his keys. She pretended not to notice, but she was planning. That night, when the house was dark and Daniel had gone to sleep, Sophie packed her bag. She took the letters, the box, the key and crept toward the front door. She had no car, but she could walk to the nearby village. It would take a few hours, but she'd make it. She just needed to get out. But as she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her. "I trusted you." She turned slowly. Daniel stood in the hallway, holding something in his hand. Not keys, a hammer. His eyes were cold now, empty. "You opened the door," he said softly. "You let her out." Sophie's heart pounded. "Daniel, let me go. You don't have to do this." "She's angry now," he said, stepping closer. "You've made everything worse." Then the lights flickered. The house groaned. and a scream ripped through the walls. It wasn't Sophie, it wasn't Daniel, it was Elise, and it was coming from every direction at once. Daniel dropped the hammer, his hands flying to his ears. Make it stop, make it stop. Sophie ran. She didn't stop until she reached the village. She was barefoot, her coat soaked from snow, her face pale, but she had the letters and the truth. Sophie sat in the small police station of the nearby village, wrapped in a blanket. Her fingers trembled as she handed over the wooden box filled with letters. The officer on duty, a tall man with tired eyes, looked confused. He walked through the forest alone at night, he asked. Sophie nodded. Her boots were still soaked from snow, and her lips trembled from cold and fear. Please, she whispered, you have to read those letters. He's not who he says he is. The officer opened the top letter, brow furrowing as he scanned the page. It was Elise's handwriting, clear, detailed, emotional words like trapped. And he won't let me leave stood out in bold. He read a few more pages, his face growing more serious by the minute. You say her name was Elise Carter? Yes, Sophie replied quickly. She was Daniel's wife. He told me she took her life 2 years ago. But after I opened the door, I saw her. She spoke to me. She's still in that house. The officer blinked. You're saying she's alive? No, Sophie whispered. I'm saying she never left. By sunrise, a team of local police were on their way to Daniel's estate. Sophie rode in the back of one of the vehicles, clutching a cup of hot tea. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't stop replaying the look on Daniel's face when he stood in the hallway, holding that hammer and blaming her for setting Elise free. What had he meant by that? Did he know Elise's spirit was still there? Had he heard her? 2. The house came into view, standing quiet and cold in the morning snow. Daniel was nowhere in sight. Inside the house, officers moved carefully, searching each room. Sophie led them straight to the west corridor. She pointed at the door at the end. It's behind there, she said. An officer stepped forward, tried the handle. It was unlocked now. The room inside looked exactly as Sophie remembered. The old bed, the broken chair, the cold air. But there was no spirit, no whisper, no shadow. It was just still. Then, another officer called from the attic. We found something. Everyone rushed upstairs. Behind an old trunk, under rotting floorboards, they uncovered a box of photographs, several of Elise's journals, and something else, a burned piece of a letter, half destroyed by fire. Sophie gently picked it up and read the words still visible. If anything happens to me, look in the wall. The officer in charge gave the order to search the walls in Elise's room. They found it quickly, behind a section of the wooden paneling, a small space, sealed with nails. Inside it was a torn piece of Elise's clothing, and bones. Human bones. The officers went silent. One whispered, she never left this room. Daniel was found 2 hours later, wandering deep in the forest, barefoot and delirious. His hands were scraped, and he kept mumbling one phrase over and over. She wouldn't stop screaming. He didn't fight when the police handcuffed him, didn't speak when they asked questions, didn't even look at Sophie when she stood just a few feet away. He simply sat in the snow, staring at nothing. The next few days were a blur. Forensic teams confirmed the remains were Elise's. The autopsy revealed signs of trauma, not suicide. Daniel had lied. He had locked her in that room. He'd burned letters, tried to destroy evidence, then created a story that would make everyone believe he was the grieving husband. But Elise wouldn't be silenced. Even in death, Sophie became the center of the story. News outlets picked it up. Writer discovers hidden truth in haunted Alps. Retreat. Some called her brave. Others didn't believe her. I don't care, she said in an interview. I didn't come to write this story, but it found me, and Elise deserved to be heard. She stayed in the village for a few weeks, testifying in the investigation and helping Elise's family recover what was left of her belongings. One morning, Sophie stood once more in front of the house. Police tape wrapped around the doors. Snow fell softly over the roof. She walked to the west corridor. One last time. The door was still open, the room still cold. She placed one of Elise's letters on the windowsill, folded gently, and whispered, "You're free now." For the first time, the house felt still. Peaceful, like it could finally breathe again. 2 months had passed since Sophie last saw the house. It was now abandoned, quiet under thick layers of snow. The police had finished their investigation. Daniel was in custody, awaiting trial. The truth was finally out. but the silence he left behind was heavier than his lies. Elisa's story had shaken the village and beyond. It made headlines in several countries. People were shocked that something so dark had stayed hidden for so long. But most of all, they were shocked that it took a stranger, a visitor, to uncover it. Sophie hadn't planned to become part of such a story. She had only come to write, but the story had chosen her. Now, back in London, Sophie sat at her desk, staring at a blank page. For weeks, she had avoided writing. Her mind was full of Elisa's voice, the sound of that door creaking open, and Daniel's eyes as he whispered. She wouldn't stop screaming. But today felt different. Today, she needed to write. Not for herself, not for a publisher, but for Elise. She began her book with one line. The door looked ordinary until I opened it. The words flowed like water after that. She wrote everything, from the moment Daniel handed her the key, to the ghostly whispers in the night, to the moment she saw Elisa's reflection in the mirror. But more than that, she wrote about silence. The kind of silence that traps people in pain. The kind that covers up ugly truths behind pretty walls. The kind that destroys lives when no one is willing to listen. She titled the book, The Room at the End of the Hall. A year later, the book became a bestseller. Readers around the world wrote messages of support. Some shared their own stories, of being silenced, of not being believed, of living with fear behind closed doors. Sophie realized Elisa's story wasn't rare. Too many people were locked in rooms no one saw. Not just physical rooms, but emotional ones. Rooms of fear, of control, of secrets. Elisa's sister, Claire, reached out after the book was published. They met in a quiet cafe, where Claire gave Sophie a tight, tearful hug. You gave her a voice, Claire whispered. You gave her peace. Sophie held her hand. She gave me strength. Together, they set up a foundation in Elisa's name to help women in isolated situations, especially those being emotionally or physically abused. They called it the Open Door Project. The mission was simple. No one should be locked away and forgotten. One autumn morning, Sophie returned to the house for the last time. It was scheduled for demolition. The land would later be used to build a small writing retreat. This time, one that would be open, warm, and safe. Before the house was taken down, Sophie walked through it once more, room, by memory. In the west corridor, the door was still there. The wood had cracked, the paint peeled, but it stood as a symbol. She touched it gently. Goodbye, she whispered. The air was still. No knocks, no whispers, just quiet, peaceful, gentle quiet. She stepped outside, and behind her, the house was no longer a place of fear. It had become a grave of secrets that had finally been laid to rest. The lessons sometimes, the things we're warned not to open, are exactly the things we need to face. Sophie had been told never to open the door, but behind that door was a truth that needed light, a voice that had been silenced, and a woman who had been forgotten. In life, people often hide their pain. They live behind doors that look normal from the outside. They smile, they say I'm fine, but inside, they're trapped, waiting for someone to notice. Sophie didn't save Elise in time to bring her back, but she gave her story meaning, and through that, Elise helps save others. Some doors are locked for protection, but some are locked to hide cruelty. It takes courage to tell the difference, and even more courage to turn the key. Final word. Sophie's life was never the same after that winter. She never returned to the house again, but she carried Elise's memory everywhere, in her words, in her mission, and in every room she ever entered. She looked twice. She listened carefully, because once you've opened a door like that, you never walk past another one the same way again.